Are we weaponizing Aboriginal rights? In light of compounding land ownership legal cases in BC, it's time to take an analytical, deep dive into the rapidly accelerating challenge to traditional fee simple ownership. Many, probably most, BC property owners are rightfully concerned that the recognition of Aboriginal title, pari passu, or equal in legal terms, to fee simple titled ownership may impact both the value of and the disposition of their own property. The Cowichan Richmond, BC land claims may have been one of the first of many legal challenges and judicial decisions to be widely reported and debated in the public space, but it was nowhere near the first or only such case. There are many more certain to follow. In fact, a quick review of public records indicates that there are literally hundreds of similar cases either currently before the courts, in process, or in negotiation across Canada. Another equally alarming case came to light in Kamloops, BC, where an unsuspecting Bearland owner unearthed some Aboriginal skeletal remains and is now on the hook for more than $100,000 in archaeological and legal fees with no end in sight. It is reported that the local Indian band wants a further $80,000 in additional fees, including 24-hour security at double the normal rate. The property in question is valued at $440,000, so you do the math. Almost all BC is not under historical treaty signature, resulting in the very real possibility that Aboriginal title land claims are going to multiply, possibly exponentially. Many BC property owners are now justifiably concerned that their previously considered indefeasible ownership of land is now in jeopardy. Should we be concerned? Absolutely, but we should always have been concerned. Most Canadians remain blissfully unaware or unconcerned that real property ownership in Canada has always been at the pleasure of the Crown. Fee simple title in Canada is dramatically different from absolute land ownership in the U.S., as an example. In Canada, absolute indefeasible title does not exist, nor has it ever existed. An AI search using Grok confirms the following. Absolute property rights do not exist in Canada in the sense of unrestricted, inviolable ownership that cannot be overridden by the state or other superior claims. Private property ownership in Canada, typically in the form of fee simple title, is the closest to what many of us think of as full ownership. It grants broad rights to use, enjoy, sell, lease, or bequeath the land, subject to laws and regulations, i.e., zoning, environmental rules, taxes, and building codes. However, these rights are not absolute for several key reasons. There's no constitutional protection. Unlike the U.S. Fifth Amendment, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms 1982 deliberately excludes explicit protection for property rights. Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person, and 8, unreasonable search and seizure, offer some indirect safeguards in limited contexts, but they do not prevent government interference with property. The Charter focuses on personal rights rather than economic ones. Expropriation, eminent domain. Federal, provincial, and municipal governments can compulsorily acquire land, private land, for public purposes, highways, parks, infrastructure, under statutes like the Federal Expropriation Act or provincial equivalents. Owners are entitled to fair market value compensation, but they cannot block the taking if it meets legal requirements. There is no constitutional right to refuse or to demand compensation beyond what the statute allows. Crown's underlying title. All land in Canada is ultimately held under the Crown, federal or provincial. Private owners hold estates granted by the Crown, but the Crown retains radical or underlying title. This allows the state to impose restrictions, reclaim land through escheat if an owner dies without heirs, or exercise other sovereign powers, Aboriginal title. Indigenous people hold inherent Aboriginal title in many areas, recognized as a constitutionally protected right under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. Recent acts, including the Cowichan Tribes versus Canada, have affirmed that Aboriginal title can exist over lands previously granted in fee simple to private owners. While private titles are not automatically extinguished, Aboriginal title is a prior and senior burden, requiring reconciliation and potentially limiting how private owners can use or defend their land against Indigenous claims. Regulatory limits in property law. Property is treated as a bundle of rights rather than absolute domain. Governments can regulate using extensively planning laws, environmental protections, common law principles like nuisance or trespass, impose duty on owners. There's all sorts of ways in which the provided use is made contrary to law or regulation, in which case you've got nothing. In summary, while Canadians enjoy strong, secure, and well-protected private property rights under common law, statutes, and limited land title systems, are relative and qualified, subject to government override for public interests, Indigenous rights, legal obligations. This reflects Canada's legal tradition, viewing property as a social institution balanced against broader societal needs rather than an unassailable individual entitlement. While little of this is news to legal scholars, bankers, bureaucrats, or politicians, the recent court decisions clearly indicate a paradigm shift of potentially monumental proportion. Let's get back to basic economics, specifically the concept supply and demand. Land or real estate is a finite commodity. In economic terms, it is essentially inelastic. We cannot increase the supply through actual physical creation of surface land in Canada. As a result, we cannot offset rising prices resulting from increased population demands by producing more physical product, except through the regulatory process, including subdivision, zoning, development permits, and the like. There are those who will argue we have some modicum of control over the supply side, and I will grudgingly agree, but mostly to move past a specious argument. Again, basic economics tells us the easiest way to make the supply side of real estate available to those on the demand side of the equation is to make the finite side more affordable. More affordability means more of our children, grandchildren, newcomers to Canada, even investors can avail themselves of the luxury of home ownership. Anyone paying attention, however, has long since realized we have actually in the past 3 or 4 decades managed to make home ownership, real estate ownership, far less affordable, to the point that the whole house of cards is on the point of collapse. Even in a softening real estate market, Grok reports the average home cost in Vancouver, BC as $1,189,000, with a minimum required down payment including fees of $93,900. A buyer must qualify with a verifiable gross household income of $220,000 to $250,000. Yeah, you read that correctly. You need $250,000 per year to purchase the average home in BC's Lower Mainland. Is it any wonder that we have created an unaffordability crisis, the likes of which we have never seen? Circling back, how does this relate to the deliberate recognition and enforcement of Aboriginal title by the courts, as facilitated by legislation passed by both the federal and provincial governments of the past half decade? Can we decrease demand? Yeah. And this is where it might get tricky. If the ultimate goal is to decrease demand, at least temporarily until the affordability crisis is mitigated, what politically expedient tools does the government have available? Unaffordability reduces economic demand, but it does not reduce societal or social demand. Canadian winters still get cold, and we all need a place to sleep. Homeless shelters are not the answer for most Canadians. "You will own nothing and you'll be happy," was the infamous quote attributed to a Danish author affiliated with the World Economic Forum, coincidentally meeting once again in Davos, Switzerland. Check out Mark Carney's speech today, January 20th, 2026, in Davos, that we should send that I think should send alarm to all Canadians who value freedom and prosperity. He's going down a very tricky path. Politicians and bureaucrats are learning that most Canadians are not buying into this socialist utopia. Here's the conspiracy theory bombshell for those of you looking for another good conspiracy theory. One way to make societal home ownership less attractive, thus relieving some of the political pressure, is to increase the uncertainty of real property acquisition, thereby making it less attractive. Demand pressures will temporarily at least subside once we collectively own less and are only marginally unhappy. What has been selected as the tool to deflect disgruntled voters away from the very real failures of our government at all levels in the past few inept decades of economic stagnation? Well, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, of course. Ask yourself why the oath of citizenship to the now King Charles was amended January 21st, 2021 to including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This change was made pursuant to Bill C-8, an act to amend the Citizenship Act, Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's Call to Action number 94. Divide and conquer is the strategy of Machiavellian politicians, including Trudeau's Liberals, who have now mismanaged Canada for a decade. Alarmingly, Mark Carney may prove even worse. My analysis and conclusion? Canada, including BC, is desperately attempting to disguise its own failed economic policies, including a growing unaffordability crisis, by deflecting the blame, by attributing land title uncertainty, potentially chaos, to the statutory inclusion of Aboriginal title as contemplated by UN DRIP and DRIPA legislation, Bill C-8 and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations. David Eby and Mark Carney are hoping we will be distracted from their own ineptitude and failures as evidenced by their clear mismanagement of the economy, civil rights, and societal cohesion. An entire reconciliation industry has been fostered in Canada. Politicians and bureaucrats are abrogating their responsibilities to citizens by making the Aboriginal communities and Canada's judicial system the fall guys for the legislators' own destructive policies that are jeopardizing the well-being and future prospects of Canada and Canadians. I think we have to reflect carefully when we go to the polls and vote for these politicians. I'm Glenn Waleska, your moderator and host, Voice of the West, Independent Media Canada, broadcasting to you today, off-grid from somewhere in the Monashee. You all have yourselves a great one. Take care.